Hello, this is Dr. James Camp from Lee College in Baytown, Texas, and this is an introduction to the wonderful world of respiration. Today we're just going to talk about the major functions of the respiratory system and some of the processes associated with the respiratory system, which we'll get to, and they're broken down here, but we'll get to them in a few seconds. First, however, I want to talk about the functions of the respiratory system in very, very general terms. The most obvious is when we ask what has your respiratory system done for you, is that it has brought oxygen into your body. Okay, and hopefully by the time we're done with this presentation today, you'll understand how much there is involved in that process of bringing oxygen into your body and just exactly why that is so important. Then on the other side, expelling CO2 from your body is equally important to bringing oxygen in. For every molecule of oxygen that our body breaks down, it produces a molecule of carbon dioxide, and that carbon dioxide would poison us not just by keeping some amount of oxygen out of the body, but also we'll talk in a minute about its effect on the direct effect of carbon dioxide on the blood. Okay, there are some less obvious functions of the respiratory system, or at least things that you couldn't do without the respiratory system. One of them, if you've ever think for a moment about what you do if someone hands you a flower. Okay, the first thing you do is you hold it up to your nose and you take a deep inhalation. Okay, well, that's because you're trying to bring smell molecules to your olfactory fibers. So the respiratory system facilitates your sense of smell, your olfactory sense. Another one that you're experiencing right now is that I'm talking to you. I couldn't talk if I didn't have air moving across my vocal cords. So the respiratory system produces sound and speech. Okay. And then finally, one that most of my students don't guess right away. Well, most of my students don't guess smell or sound and speech right away either, but one that they really don't guess right away is pH regulation. And for that, I want to come over to a little chemistry corner and explain to you a little bit about the relationship between pH and CO2. First off, let's start with what pH is. Okay, this is not a chemistry class, so we're not going to go into tremendous detail about what pH is, but pH exists on a spectrum where 7 in the very middle is, let me change those, pH. 7 in the very middle is neutral H2O. Now, if I went and got some water from my tap over here in my teaching lab, it would probably not be a perfect 7. That's because water is an extraordinarily good solvent. It picks up minerals and salts and whatever it can really from any pipes that it travels through, any water basins that it comes in contact with when it's waiting for us to pick it up and turn it into drinking water. And of course, the water treatment that we put it through itself may affect its pH. So by the time it reaches my tap and goes into my glass, it's probably somewhere between 6.5 and 7.5, but I couldn't tell you exactly where it is. There's not a really great way to predict that. But I do know that if I took that water and I distilled it and captured just pure water in a plastic water bottle that had no minerals that could shift its pH, that pure water would be a pH 7. And the reason for that is that H2O, as you know, is this molecule, HOH. Well, if we redraw that slightly, we can see it as HO-H, and we can see that this one little bond here is maybe a little bit fragile. So this HOH can split into an H plus and an OH minus. And it turns out that in all water, neutral water, this nice perfect H2O is always in an equilibrium with H plus and OH minus. And the amount of H plus that you get in neutral water is 10 to the minus 7. Okay, very, very small number. That would be 0.1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 zeros and a 1. That's how much H plus you get. Not a lot. So we take that 7 from the 10 and we turn it into a pH number. That's what pH means, the negative logarithm of the hydrogen ion concentration. Okay. If we add more H plus to the water, we can get to a point where we have 10 to the minus 5th, or even as much as 10 to the minus 1 H plus. That gets us places like HCl, stomach acid. It's a pretty strong acid, shows up around here, around 10 to the negative 1. 10 to the negative 4, 10 to the negative 5, somewhere in there would be vinegar, a kind of a weak acid. Vinegar is a weak acid, but if you pour it on, if you mix it with sodium bicarbonate or calcium carbonate, it makes a nice fizzy, bubbly reaction that shows that the acid and the base are reacting with each other. Okay, if we go in the other direction, less H plus, more OH minus, okay, we get H plus, maybe instead of 10 to the 7th, we have 10 to the negative 10th. That would be a pH 10, and that might be something like baking soda, which is actually, I don't think, quite that strong. We can go further, 10 to the negative 12, even 10 to the negative 14. Somewhere in here are things like lye soaps, sodium hydroxide, okay, have very, very strong basic tendency to them. And in fact, a lot of the household cleaners that you get out there are very strongly basic. Okay, so where do you think your blood fits on this? The answer is it's close to neutral, but not quite. It is 7.4. plus or minus a very small amount on each side, plus or minus 0.05 on either side. So how, you may ask, when we have this wide range from pH 1 to pH 14, how does blood stay so close to this exact number of 7.4? And the answer is that there is something called a buffer. Actually, there are multiple buffers that act on your blood to stabilize its pH. The one we're going to talk about today starts with CO2 plus good old H2O. And if you rearrange those atoms into a single molecule, you get H2CO3, which is also known as carbonic acid. And then if you let it sit in water long enough, you get HCO3 minus and free H plus. HCO3 minus is called bicarbonate. It's the active ingredient in baking soda, and because of this, this whole thing is called the bicarbonate buffer system. So what you see is that if you add a whole lot of carbon dioxide to your blood, that's going to shift this whole thing this way, and you're going to be left with more H plus in your blood. That's going to drive your pH down, give you what we call acidosis. If, on the other hand, we have a big drop in CO2 in your blood, then this is all going to go the other way. You're going to have less H plus, more alkaline blood, and so we call that alkalosis. So your respiratory system plays an absolutely critical role in maintaining your blood pH by controlling this, how much CO2 is in your blood and how much this equation shifts to the left or the right to give you more acid or less acid in your blood. Okay, so now let's break apart respiratory physiology into 5 phases of respiratory activity. The first phase, which is what most people think of when they think of breathing, is called let me see if I can write this a little bit better. Pulmonary ventilation. And in this phase, you have a person. I'm not a great artist at the best of times, but drawing on a computer screen is making it worse. See, this person's wearing a mask for COVID-19. Okay. We'll just draw a nice little mask there for him. Okay. Air comes in through his nasal passages, down through his larynx and trachea and bronchi into these nice organs called lungs. And then when that air has gotten sort of stale, so to speak, it travels back out the same way. Goes back out the way it came in. So this is bulk movement of air. Okay, so we typically think of respiration as oxygen moving into your body, carbon dioxide moving out of your body. This is a bulk movement of air. So you may be breathing in fresh air that is higher in oxygen and lower in CO2. You may be breathing out stale air that is lower in oxygen and higher in CO2, but you're always breathing in a mixture of oxygen and CO2, and you're always breathing out a mixture of oxygen and CO2. So you're not breathing different gases in different directions. You're breathing in a whole mixture of oxygen, CO2, and several other gases. Most of the air we breathe is actually nitrogen. About 80% of the air is nitrogen, which doesn't do anything for our body at all. Why does this bulk movement of air happen? Well, if you remember from our section on the movement of blood in the cardiovascular system, you'll remember that fluids flow from high pressure to low pressure. Okay, so what is causing all of this bulk movement of air? Is pressure differences between atmospheric pressure and intrapulmonary pressure, IP pressure. Okay, so we could write that as P atmosphere and P intrapulmonary, IP. Okay, and this is all caused by changes in lung size due to certain skeletal muscles. Okay, so we will get in a future lecture to looking at exactly what changes in lung size are going on and what skeletal muscles are responsible for them. But for right now, all you need to know is that a small box contains a high pressure, a large box contains a low pressure. So we can make the lungs get bigger and drop the pressure in the lungs, and that pulls air in. We can make the lungs get smaller and increase the pressure in the lungs, and that pushes air out. Okay, so after pulmonary ventilation, there is a process of external respiration, which is also known by a couple of other names. Every time we talk about respiration, we're talking about gas exchange. Okay, that is a step where carbon dioxide and oxygen are moving in opposite directions. So here, if we zoom in a little bit on our lungs, we'll find that there are these air sacs in the lungs. Let me try doing that again. There are these air sacs in the lungs. called alveoli. And as air moves in and then back out, it brings a certain amount of oxygen in, and there is always also a certain amount of carbon dioxide. Now, flowing right along beside that through blood capillaries is some amount of blood. Okay? The blood comes in, I drew that backwards. The blood comes in blue. That is with high CO2 and low oxygen. As it passes through the lungs, the blood turns red. It becomes high oxygen, low CO2. And the way that happens is that CO2 leaves the blood into the alveoli, into the respiratory space, the air space. Oxygen leaves the air and makes its way into the blood. So we can see this as being two spaces here. There is blood traveling through, and there is air coming in, moving in and out. And oxygen is moving from the air to the blood. CO2 is moving from the blood to the air. So oxygen and CO2 are moving in opposite directions. That's what makes this a respiration step. Okay. What causes this? This is caused by concentration, also known as partial pressure differences that create diffusion. Okay, so your oxygen is in high concentration in the air, low concentration in the blood, so it will diffuse down its concentration gradient until the blood equals the air. Carbon dioxide comes in high concentration in the blood, and low concentration in the air. It will diffuse down its concentration gradient until the blood and the air are equal. Okay. Now if we zoom back out, look at our person again. We have those lungs here in the middle of the body, but we also have a hungry muscle here in the arm that maybe wants to do some work. And for it to do that work, it would like to have oxygen. So we go to our friend, the heart, which you remember has a blue side and a red side. Okay, so the red blood that we've just filled up with oxygen in the lungs travels to the left side of the heart, and then from there it gets pumped to our organs. Then the organ takes the oxygen out of it, puts CO2 back into it. It travels back to the right side of the heart, and from there that blue blood travels back to the lungs. And that's what makes this a step called circulation. Okay, the high oxygen blood is circulating to the tissues. The low oxygen blood is circulating back to the lungs, but it is a circulation. It keeps circling back and forth. This is also known as gas transport. Okay. Now we have the bulk movement of blood. Okay. And so again, you may have red blood that is high oxygen, low CO2, but it is not no CO2. There is still CO2 around because we need it for that buffering of the pH. And then there is blue blood, which you know is low oxygen, high CO2, but again, it is not no oxygen. Hemoglobin, even as it's traveling through the blue blood, still has some amount of oxygen bound to it. So again, we're moving oxygen and CO2 together in both directions. We just happen to have a high oxygen situation and a low oxygen situation. And this, as of course you recall from our previous unit on the cardiovascular system, is caused by blood pressure differences created by the pumping action of the heart. Okay. Then we have a step called internal respiration. Again, this is also known as gas exchange. Here, if we zoom in on that muscle, we'll see an arteriole carrying red blood in, a venule carrying blue blood out, and a capillary bed in between that is busy exchanging nutrients and gases with the tissue. In this case, the tissue is low in oxygen because it is busy metabolizing. It is taking oxygen out of the fluid around it, and it is high in CO2 because it is busy making CO2. Like I said, every time we use up an oxygen, we make a CO2. So as blood flows through here, oxygen is leaving the blood, CO2 is entering the blood, and we have another exchange. So once again, we have blood and we have tissue, and this time the oxygen is diffusing from blood into the tissue, and CO2 is diffusing from the tissue into the blood. And once again, it's caused by, the cause is same as external respiration. It's caused by those concentration gradients that create diffusion. Okay, now if we zoom in on a single muscle cell here, we'll find that that muscle cell has lots of these little organelles called mitochondria in them. And if we looked at a far enough away distance, we would just see oxygen traveling into the mitochondria, and carbon dioxide traveling out of it. There are, of course, more complicated processes going on inside the mitochondria. We have the citric acid cycle and the electron transport chain here. We have glucose fuel molecules or other fuel molecules feeding into this as well. We have water coming out as a byproduct. And of course, we wouldn't be doing this if we weren't getting ATP out as a result. So this, instead of talking about things moving from one place to another, we're going to talk about chemical reactions going on. So we have glucose as an input, oxygen as an input, and ADP as an input. And we're going to get out CO2 plus H2O plus ATP, the active energetic form. Okay? And that process is known as cellular respiration, because again, we have oxygen and CO2 sort of moving in opposite directions. We have oxygen as an input to this system and CO2 as an output of this system. Okay. So this is a summary of the 5 phases of respiration in a more textual form for those of you who like words more than pictures. Pulmonary ventilation brings fresh air into the lungs. External respiration moves oxygen into the blood and CO2 out of the blood. Circulation carries oxygen to the tissues and CO2 away from the tissues, but again, we're always moving both gases at the same time. Internal respiration moves oxygen from blood into tissues, CO2 from tissues into blood. And then finally, cellular respiration, the oxygen combines with the fuel in the mitochondria, and CO2 is produced as part of our waste products that we then have to get rid of. So we have a net travel of oxygen into the body here, a net travel of CO2 out of the body. If you like pictures more than words, here's a picture of that oxygen moving into the body, gets to the systemic cells, combines with fuel in the mitochondria, moves CO2, moves back into the blood, travels back out into the atmosphere. Okay. Last but not least on this journey, I want to track the journey of a molecule into the body, and then we have an oxygen molecule here moving into the body, and then a CO2 molecule over here moving out of the body. Okay. So stage 1, pulmonary ventilation, fresh air, high in O2 is inhaled, moves through the various airways that we'll learn the anatomy of in a future lecture, enters the alveoli of the lungs. Stage 2, external respiration, also known as gas exchange, and sometimes they call it pulmonary, or sometimes they call it alveolar gas exchange. In this case, we're still talking about oxygen molecules move from air into blood, and as they get there, those oxygen molecules are loaded onto hemoglobin. We'll talk about how oxygen is carried on hemoglobin in the next lecture. Stage 3 then is our circulation, also known as gas transport. Blood moves to the left heart and to the systemic circulation. And in the systemic circulation, internal respiration happens, also known as tissue gas exchange or systemic gas exchange. Here, oxygen molecules are unloaded from hemoglobin, and oxygen molecules move from blood into tissues, and that sets the stage for stage 5, cellular respiration, where in the mitochondria of the cells, 1 glucose plus 6 oxygen react to produce 6 CO2, 6 H2O, and 36 ATP. Okay, so you can see that the whole reason we breathe, the entire reason we need oxygen in our body, is to produce the ATP that our cells need to stay alive. And the entire reason we breathe out is because as we do this, we accumulate CO2 as a byproduct, and we have to move that out of our body. Okay, so moving backward, stage 4, internal respiration, CO2 molecules move from tissue into blood. Okay, and CO2 molecules are converted into carbonic acid, which joins the bicarbonate buffer system. That is the main way that CO2 is carried around in our blood, not actually as free CO2 molecules. Blood travels this time through the right heart and into the pulmonary circulation. Okay, where in the lungs, carbonic acid molecules convert back into CO2. CO2 molecules move from blood into air, and then stale air, which is high in CO2, leaves the lungs, moves through the airways again, and is exhaled. Whew, we're done. Okay. Hopefully you now understand a little bit more about the incredibly complex process that is involved in moving oxygen into your body and CO2 out of your body, and that it's not just about breathing, but that several more things have to happen afterward. In the next lectures, we'll talk about how oxygen and CO2 are carried in the blood. Then we'll talk about the anatomy of the ventilation system, the airways and the lungs. And then finally, we'll talk about the physiology of making pulmonary ventilation happen. All right. If you feel like you learned something, leave me a like and a comment in the space below, and study hard.